Hello there. Environment, social and corporate governance, or ESG, is one of the most radical and transformative business developments within the last 50 years. It's going to shape the way both organisations and the communications sector evolve and operate for years to come. But what is ESG? And how is public relations adapting to the opportunities and risks? Well, to answer these questions, we commissioned a report authored by Dr. John White and Stephen Waddington, and there should be a link in the chat if you want to download it. To support the report, we surveyed 187 public relations practitioners to benchmark the sector's understanding of and the readiness for ESG. Now, this study highlighted that organisations are moving at very different speeds when it comes to ESG. Many PR professionals understand the principles. In fact, the study found that 63% of them claimed that they could confidently define ESG and its impact on their clients or their organisation. But many are yet to create clear frameworks for the business and also the communications function. In fact, 2/3 of organisations said that they don't report on their ESG performance. 31% of respondents reported that they have a policy in place to manage ESG. 41% said it was a work in progress, and 27% said that they had taken no action at all to assess and manage ESG risk. So the full set of results from the ESG and the PR sector survey is contained within the report, including the percentage of agencies providing ESG services for their clients, as well as data on who leads ESG within organisations. My name is Michelle Goodall, and I'm CMO at Access Intelligence, and I'm delighted to be joined today by the report co-authors and also Head of Communications and External Affairs for Hybrid Air Vehicles, Rebecca Zeitlin. I'm going to ask the panel some questions for the next 30 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to your questions. So please do add them in the chat function as we go along. Oh, sorry, apologies, not the chat function, the Q&A function as we go along, and we'll cover as many as we can at the end. So introducing Dr. John White. He's a chartered psychologist and a chartered member and honorary fellow of the CIPR. He began his career in communications roles within the government of Alberta, Canada, and progressed through university positions in Canada and the UK to becoming an independent consultant for organisations including large corporations, international government organisations and others. He's the author of 2 books on public relations. He holds a doctorate in psychology from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and he's a visiting professor at Henley Business School, University of Reading, and honorary professor at Cardiff University School of Journalism, Media and Culture. Stephen Waddington is a professional advisor to agencies and communications teams, author and teacher. His agency clients include Allegory, Don't Cry Wolf, Lim PR, Miramar Group, Source Code and Stories Comms. He's also developed projects for the Government Communications Service and the NHS, and Stephen authors one of the UK's leading blogs and top Vuelio blog on communications, and is an author on a number of marketing and PR books, including Exploring PR and Management Communication and Brand Anarchy. He's also a visiting professor at Newcastle University and a former president of the CIPR. Now, researching the report, they spoke to a number of communications experts with ESG experience, and one of them joins us today. Rebecca Zeitlin is the Head of Communications and External Affairs for Hybrid Air Vehicles. And Rebecca is part of the senior leadership team there and was responsible for strategic communications, including corporate affairs, brand marketing and outreach. She's also a chartered PR and is chair of the CIPR's STEM sector group and a non-portfolio committee member of STEMPRA. So after that introduction, let's kick off with a question and a reminder to you all to put your questions in the Q&A function. John and Stephen, let's start at the very beginning, shall we? Can you please explain what ESG is and why we say it will shape the way that organisations and communications as a sector will evolve and operate for years to come?
Well, shall I go first on this, Stephen? First of all, thank you, Michelle, for the introduction, and Vuelio for the initiative in sponsoring this report, and also all of you who have chosen to participate in this afternoon's discussion. ESG, let's be clear from the outset, is a new way of referring to a set of concerns which have been with us for many years. And the concerns have been referred to under other labels. We talked in the 1990s, for example, of the triple bottom line. This is referring to a concern for people, planet, and profits, a new way of doing business. ESG is a label that's been current now, we'd say, for about 20 years or so, coming out of UN discussions and other discussions of the way business will need to adapt to changing circumstances. The term has been given new force by the COVID pandemic. So it brings all these issues to the fore, the issues of environment, of social responsibility of business, and the need for improved approaches to governance. And so when we say ESG, we're talking about this range of concerns for the environment, for social contribution of business, and for improvements to corporate governance. Stephen, I don't know, do you want to add to that?
No, great summary. Great.
So, Rebecca and Stephen, why has ESG suddenly become so much more important? I mean, it kind of feels as though if you're on social, you're seeing that kind of thing pop up constantly. And I don't know if you're on Twitter, the constant ads around ESG. Why the importance now?
Maybe I can start with some background and then hand over to Rebecca to give maybe the practical context from her perspective. I'd echo John's comments as well to all credit to Vuelio for taking this leadership position and sponsoring this piece of work, because ESG undoubtedly is one of the primary issues facing public relations practice at the moment. And, a question we came across throughout the work we did was, should public relations lead on this topic? Well, given ESG, as John has so succinctly said, relates to absolutely everything in the environment, society, then, absolutely we have a role. And I'm looking forward to the discussion to figure out, during this session, exactly where that role is and what it is, the contribution that public relations can make. But I'd like to say, right up front, public relations is concerned with managing relationships and stakeholders around an organisation, and that puts us firmly front and centre as part of the conversation related to ESG. John said the growing conversation spearheaded by the UN, things like the Paris Agreement, that from a political context has made this brought this forward. But I think the point you touched on right at the end was why it's become so important in practice in the last 18 months is because of COVID. And during COVID, two things have happened. Public relations as a discipline has shown itself in a leadership position, helping organizations engage with complex stakeholders and manage those through very difficult transitions, lockdown periods, periods of remote working. There was that weekend in March 2020 when every single organization that could went to remote working. Public relations practitioners have been front and center of that from a management perspective, but then also from a public health perspective in helping communicate and engage with the public through the crisis. And finally, as we're emerging in the UK at least from lockdown, around issues related to vaccination and such like. That's one thing. I think the second thing is COVID-19's highlighted flaws in the use of financial metrics to measure the well-being, to measure the health of an organisation and the well-being of society. That was kind of originally shown up during the banking crisis, the financial collapse, and here we are. We've had a second moment in time where absolutely everybody in society has been impacted in this issue, and inevitably that has an impact on how organizations are governed and managed and will do.
Yeah. And Rebecca, I mean, obviously crisis is one of the big levers for change, but are there any other factors at play in terms of, why ESG and why now?
I think obviously crisis is an accelerant to anything that's going on. But I think if we look back at, say, 2019, pre-COVID, at what was happening in the world even then, working in a business that works adjacent to aviation, we saw massive change in just that one calendar year and how people were perceiving aviation for pleasure. And really looking across the whole of ESG, a lot of things have been changing and building towards critical mass over time anyway. A lot of that being driven by climate-related concerns, whether that's the UN SDGs and the need for people to be aware of climate-induced humanitarian issues in parts of the world, right through to things like emissions, which is obviously top of mind for a lot of organizations. That critical mass is building anyway. And then you add on top of it the accelerant that was COVID. And I think the last 12 to 18 months, we've seen a massive shift in the amount of focus that's being put on this, because the entire world hit pause briefly. And in that period, there's kind of a moment to actually look at what's going on and say, wow, we really need to do something. And certainly in my own sector, the fact that every plane stopped, well, virtually every passenger plane stopped flying. No better time to take a hard look in the mirror than when that's the only thing there is to look at. And I think that scrutiny is what's driving a lot of the change now. And I think as well, PR has realized its potential. Well, I say realized, has become aware of its potential. It has not realized that potential yet. It's become aware of its potential to have influence in this way, which I think is relatively new, or it comes in waves.
Yeah, okay. So a lot of people look at ESG and they do their Google searches and obviously not those people that we surveyed, but conflate CSR, corporate social responsibility, with ESG. Stephen, I'm going to ask you this question. What's the difference between ESG and CSR?
So corporate social responsibility describes a class of initiatives where organizations make a commitment to the environment or a social contribution, and that's typically led by a marketing function within an organization. The challenge there is it's seen as masking other activities. So on one side of the organization, an organization might be doing good for environmental purposes, but on another, it may be involved in fossil fuel extraction or some other environmental harmful issue. And best example of this, I think, is one that came up during our research. BP in 2005 ran a huge campaign, well-funded campaign, to encourage people to think about their carbon footprint, and in doing so, put the onus on individuals to manage the environment and green issues, where it's quite clear that the contribution to carbon emissions from industrial activity is actually where the biggest significant changes could be made. So that's greenwashing, a veneer of a veneer of investment in environmental concern that really doesn't stand up to scrutiny when you consider the whole of a business. Fortunately, we're moving from there, though. As you say, we're on this journey from CSR to ESG, where organizations recognize that they have to consider issues in the whole as a collection of risk. ESG does relate to everything about an organization and its place in society, and so it needs to consider that in the absolute whole, and look not only at the financial value it's creating, but its environmental and societal responsibility as well.
Brilliant. So I'll ask you about some of the frameworks shortly, because corporate social responsibility doesn't have frameworks of measurement behind it, as far as my understanding is, kind of internationally. But I'm going to go over to John, if that's okay, and ask you the question. Clearly our survey suggested that there are some people who haven't even looked at the risk of not assessing and managing ESG in their organisation. So what are the risks of not doing this?
Well, the risks are huge because the issues referred to under the label of ESG involve any number of consequences: environmental damage, exploitation of labor, failure to address necessary changes in governance. So the risks are enormous, but picking up on something Rebecca was saying about the value of crisis, more generally, when you look at the way business organizations are prepared for things to go wrong, you'll find in survey after survey that quite a large percentage will not be prepared for the risks of bad things happening. When we refer to ESG, we're opening up the possibility of a wider range of risks which need to be attended to. You will still find quite a large percentage of organizations which will not be prepared. The opportunity, and we'll come back to this probably later in the discussion, but the opportunity for public relations in future is the possibility of alerting the people in organizations who have to make decisions in relation to the handling of risk, alerting those people to the broader range of risks that now need to be considered. So there's the huge opportunity for public relations. The larger task, though, is for business, which they're aware of and are currently grappling with the practical consequences of this new awareness. We refer in the report to the Business Roundtable redefinition of the purpose of the corporation. And the purpose of the corporation, according to this 2019 statement, is to move on towards serving the interests of all stakeholders, not just shareholders. So this is taken up, and you'll see this in references, say, in current discussion in the Harvard Business Review, to a new kind of stakeholder capitalism, which imposes new demands on management. And it's in those new demands that we're going to find our opportunities. Organizations will have to be run to respond to a wider range of interests. And that's exactly where we come in as public relations practitioners, because we, for years, have been saying, look, when you make decisions, you've got to think about the interests of other stakeholders. If you don't, you're running huge risks. And there are case studies galore of companies which have failed to take account of these wider risks. I mean, going back, one of the classic cases, Stephen mentioned BP. If you look at the experience of Shell in the 1990s, and one of the classic cases was of the Brent Spar, where they'd covered all the scientific arguments, but they hadn't properly addressed the environmental and the social consequences of their plans to dump a large piece of industrial equipment in the Atlantic. And they suffered the consequences, huge reputational damage. And that's the sort of risk that is being run by large corporations if they're not incorporating ESG concerns into decision-making. And therein lies the opportunity for public relations practice.
Yeah. I think, we'll come on to this later, but ESG isn't only for large corporates. It's something that needs to be considered in the round by all private organisations as well. So on to...
sorry, interrupting.
Yeah.
It's a discussion about a new way of doing business.
Absolutely.
Which bears on all business organisations.
Yeah.
All organisations, in fact. I mean, governments wrestle with the same sorts of problems, but we'll carry on the discussion.
Sure. So I'm going to go over to Rebecca, and thank you very much for contributing to the report as well and being interviewed for it. At Hybrid Air Vehicles, obviously you are in the middle of your ESG audit, your ESG reporting, and there are a number of different things that you are responsible for leading and also participating in. For the 2/3 of organisations who we surveyed who don't have any frameworks in place for their businesses or their communications function and actually don't report or measure their ESG performance, can you explain how you got started? Because I think with anything like this, just the overwhelming nature of the enormity of it probably will stop people starting in many cases. So can you give us some sort of practical ideas of how you got started?
Yeah, for us, the journey is a little bit interesting for us because at the end of the day, our product is transformatively different than anything else available in the sector and is an ultra-low emissions aircraft, essentially. So we were already starting from a place where we had a claim to kind of an environmental improvement over our competitors, which is quite helpful as a starting point because you've got a thing that you can point out and say, okay, this is an anchor point in our thinking. But what's really clear is that you can't just have one thing. I'll use the word scrutiny again, the scrutiny investors will put on the whole business, not just the product. Customers expect you to be coherent across your whole brand. It can't just be, look at this one great thing while we do all of these other things we don't talk about. So for us, we knew we had to do something. And what we started with was a materiality assessment, which is a really useful way of establishing what actually matters to your business. The reality is, as you say, ESG is enormous. And even within just the environment piece of that, there are so many factors to consider that it's important to understand what are the most important ones, because you have to start somewhere. And if you choose something that's not as important, you'll get less value out of it in terms of the journey within the organization. You need to start with something that will demonstrate why this is important. It's important to win as you go through. So we did that exercise and found that quite helpful. And that helped us understand how we were going to incorporate the thinking about sustainability into how we were going to do business. And over time, that's starting to grow. And we're now in the process of figuring out the policy decisions that we need to make as our business scales that will allow us to maintain that framework throughout the scaling process. And at each stage, we will have a series of policy decisions to make that will change as we grow. That's, I think, pretty natural. But if you start from the point of understanding what's important to your business, then you can pick the things that matter and work on them first. As you say, the reality is you can't do everything all at once unless you have a very big organization with a lot of people. Takes a lot of time. These are hard decisions. I'm in no way saying that this has been super easy, and we're a business that wants to do it right. Yeah. And everybody in the organization is committed to doing it right. And even then, we have fractious conversations about what matters. So it's helpful to break it down into manageable chunks.
So I'm assuming with these manageable chunks, but also because of reporting back to investors and potential investors, that there needs to be a focus on benchmarking, measurement and reporting. So what are the practicalities of that? How do you measure, benchmark and report?
I think, so there's a clear difference between listed businesses and businesses that aren't listed in terms of what's required. So there's a lot of discussion now around the value of a purpose statement and how you report on governance in particular, and how you demonstrate board involvement. If you're a listed business, these are things that you must do. And as time goes on, the many, many frameworks, and we could probably between us name a number of them, will start to coalesce. There's a really big drive actually to bring the frameworks together to create a more unified approach to reporting. Because at the moment, it's really hard to know which framework you should choose. There are things as well like B Corp, which certainly is an organization that is in the journey. The ability to access that assessment process even before you choose to go through it is really valuable because it gives you a framework for thinking about things. Private businesses get the luxury of choice at the moment, which is helpful. We're not listed, so we can choose what elements of which framework work for us in this stage. But any business that's scaling and planning to IPO or de-SPAC, you're going to be a listed business at the end of that process. So you're going to have to follow whatever the regulations are at the end of your listing. So it makes sense to, depending on where you are in your business's phase, choose the thing that you're going to have to do at the end so you don't have to make changes as you're going through.
Fantastic. So Stephen and John, in the report, Rebecca mentioned some of the frameworks. You mentioned these frameworks, but for those of you who haven't read it, what are the ESG frameworks that comms practitioners should need to know about and should refer to?
So just picking up off the final point there that Rebecca made, that every market around the world has broadly established a set of ESG principles, and that's the market perspective. And there's one exists for London, there's one exists for markets in the European Union, there's one exists in the US markets. That's the first thing. Second thing is then the investor communities themselves have all developed a series of matrices and frameworks, sets of data sets that describe various aspects. It's a very nascent area, and we pull out at least half a dozen different reporting standards. To Rebecca's point, it's a complex area, and you're best as an organisation looking at the endpoint and working back from there. There's been this wrestling between societal expectation and political will, driven predominantly by the UN, and moments like COP coming to Glasgow later this year provide a real impetus for discussions. Really, what's required is legislation to force to enforce and set standards for what is expected from a governance point of view. Rebecca mentioned B Corp and B Corp's particular set of standards for limited organisations, but B Corp itself is part of a coalition of organisations that are lobbying the UK government to make one change to the Companies Act 2006 related to one particular section, that's section 172, which relates to the responsibility of a director to manage a business. At the moment, it's written that you must financially manage a business to generate profit, return for the shareholders. The Better Business Act Coalition wants that changed so that the directors are forced to look at the triple bottom line and manage a company from the perspective of each of the issues of E, S, and G. And I think if that happens, that will be a huge moment. It's a really important piece of work that could really affect change.
Absolutely. I'm conscious that we have got to leave time for some questions. So please, for those of you watching, do get your questions in the Q&A function. But I'm going to keep going for now. Coming back to the point you made really early on, Stephen, and again, this is a question for you, John, and also Rebecca as well. Our research found that ESG was led by the head of communications, or PR, in 19% of the organisations surveyed. Now, this is interesting because when I discuss this with colleagues and also in other networks as well, there's arguments both ways that comms or PR and the head and the very senior person within an organisation should lead it. And then some say, well, actually, PR and communications should leave well alone when it comes to leadership, but actually should be, front and centre of this. Is there an argument that PR and comms should or shouldn't lead? Let's have that debate. What do you think?
I go to John first because he wrote this section of the report, and then Rebecca clearly has got the practical experience. I'm going to stay out.
I think it's extremely important that public relations and communications be involved in decisions that are made on these concerns. But I think it's really important, in light of some of the developments that Stephen was talking about, that the organization as a whole has responsibilities for ESG. So ESG governance, actually governance in thinking about that, becomes most important. How is the organization being run to meet these concerns? So to deliver profit and return to shareholders, certainly, but then to meet these other concerns of environmental responsibility and contribution to social well-being. So this really is for the senior decision-making groups in the organization, the board and the senior management team. And my argument would be that public relations, communications practitioners as senior advisors should be absolutely involved in that level of decision making. Now, it may be once decisions are made on these concerns, that some of them then will be delegated back to the public relations and communications function. But that's a decision for the organization as a whole, I would say. In the past, it's true that ESG concerns have been managed out of, say, external affairs departments under the broad heading of issues management. And I think that's a way of looking at organizations which is now, I would say, passé. That it really is a matter of a discussion taking place at the highest levels where decisions are being made, and then there being delegation through the organization to the relevant units within the organization to carry those responsibilities. But the absolute key thing from the public relations point of view, that public relations practitioners as senior advisors should be involved in those discussions. Because I think you'll see in the report, Corey Kangos from the PRCA talked about the unique vantage point that the public relations practitioner works from. And that's something we've always brought to high-level decision-making when it's drawn on.
Thank you, John. Rebecca, your experience and your thoughts around this, leading, involved in, front and centre, what do you think is the sort of the perfect ratio or perfect makeup, or doesn't it exist?
Don't think perfect exists, in part because it is really down to how an organization is structured. So I think, you know, as a practitioner sitting in-house, you have to look at your own spot in the organization and your own reach within that organization. And that kind of determines how much of a driving role you can have. Because at the end of the day, you can only reach as far as your arm is long. And wherever you dead end, you dead end. So, you know, for me, a lot of the outputs of any ESG policy decisions have to be actioned by an operational team. So I can't control that process, nor should I try. Nobody wants me interfering in engineering. That would be bad for everyone. So at the end of the day, you know, we do have our limits within our own organizations. I completely agree with John that these issues are big enough, impactful enough, have enough risk associated with them that they have to be discussed and decided upon at the highest levels of the organization. And your CEO is, you know, the term figurehead has a bit of a negative connotation, but your CEO must be the figurehead for this as well. You know, the fearless leader charging ahead, that has to exist for this to work. And your whole organization has to have buy-in. So I guess the short version of what I'm trying to say is, you know, within your own remit, you will have as much reach as you can have, and then figure out how you can influence more reach. If you are not working at the senior strategic level, be aware that, you know, these conversations are really going to have to go beyond you, and certainly you will have work to do at the end of it, because, you know, PR owns a lot of the relationships involved in this. Public affairs plays a big role in this story. There are lots of different elements here, and it's about understanding where you fit. You know, I have an organization that's pretty small, so, you know, I've got lots of reach, but that's because there are very many of us to reach around. You know, it is what it is. There are pros and cons to that too.
But there's all the sky up there to reach in towards, so fantastic. Stephen, one of my favourite parts of the report is the sort of the practical bit at the end, where you and John talk about actually how can any comms and PR professional contribute, if not lead, ESG within an organisation, so contribute to. So just some thoughts on that, and maybe a summary around, you know, how anybody who is listening today could contribute.
So I think if you're attending this webinar, you're already contributing. You're starting to be part of the conversation and raising your knowledge around this issue. And from there, I would encourage you to, if you haven't read the report, do so, because that provides lots of jumping off points to go and gather further information. I was really struck by the conversation with Rebecca about how, you know, she's tackled it from within her organization, and you know, done that by reaching out through different relationships, you know, both at an industry level, a government level, supplier level, and then internally, and so, you know, in the survey data we gathered, we had a whole range of responses from people at a very early stage to people who firmly got to grips with managing ESG and reporting on it. I think you've got to start small with each of the dimensions. I think any organisation has to recognise, to use Rebecca's phrase, the reach an opportunity that it has. But at the end of the report, as you suggest, we put together this a framework along 8 dimensions where we suggested, how you could, as a practitioner, become part of these conversations, and that ranges from strategic planning and risk management. If you're operating at a strategic level, ESG has to absolutely be part of that, through to managing conversations internally through various different stakeholder groups. John and Rebecca both said this fundamentally has to reside and be owned by leadership at a board level, but then public relations as a department has can be a conduit to bring stakeholders together and manage that. Some of the areas we look at are things like horizon scanning. Shout out for Vuelio. Clearly, your interest in this area is you provide media intelligence to help organisations understand both earned media and conversations in the public sphere as they relate to organisations. So that horizon scanning, both from a risk perspective and from an operational perspective, is important. And then, much of the work around ESG involves, reporting within an organisation transparently and plotting the journey that the organisation is making. So helping frame meaningful metrics. At the moment, around ESG, there's a bit of targetitis in that, everyone's setting carbon zero targets for 2050, 30 years out, when we'll hopefully all be way out of retirement. I think it's important that any metrics that an organisation sets are meaningful, and that then is held accountable to those through reporting via the comms team. So yeah, there's a quick snapshot of some of the areas where practitioners can get involved from an organisational perspective.
Fantastic, thank you. And I will just add, because otherwise I'll get a dead leg from some of my colleagues, it's not just Vuelio that is, should be part of your PR tech stack to benchmark, scan, monitor and measure concerns from lots of different stakeholders, but also Pulsar, which can provide early warning signs around issues, activism through all forms of social media. And that's quite important, because particularly with a younger and a more diverse audience, those conversations are no longer just taking place in one or two of those social media platforms, but TikTok, Instagram, and the list goes on. So I think what we'll do now, if that's okay, is go to the questions, and please do add questions as we go along. We've also had some that have been pre-sent by people who were unable to attend live today, so I might come back to those as well. But I'm going to pick up on the first question and basically ask you, John, Stephen, Rebecca, whoever wants to pick this one up. Oh, actually, no, it's a question directly to you, Rebecca. And this is from Hannah Jones, and she's talking about employee engagement. How do you bring them along on your company's journey into ESG? And, Rachel Miller in the report also talked about the critical role for internal communications and the critical role for employees, being active participants, and also kind of the measure of what you should be aiming for, and also, I guess, the metronome as to whether or not you're achieving that or not. So that's a question specifically for you. How do you engage your employees? How do you bring them along on your company's journey?
Well, the first thing I would say actually is something you mentioned just then is this is all a really nice idea, and it's wonderful if the board are on side and your executive are on side and everything looks great. But at the end of the day, it fails if the staff aren't behind it. And that's true of any kind of core strategic exercise like this, because at the end of the day, you're reliant on staff to deliver the outcome that you've asked for. So if right down to supply chain's a perfect example. If you say we want our supply chain to achieve X target in ESG metrics, and then the people who are negotiating with that supply chain aren't on side with that idea, you are automatically going to fall over right at the first hurdle, because you've got to have every person has a role to play. I think this is where I feel like purpose and values are really important, values in particular. I think a lot of organizations have values because they feel like they must. The reality is that values help staff make decisions, and values that are properly embedded will help staff believe in what your executive are saying. So to me, that's a key role for communications, is in making sure that, you know, these grand statements of ESG goals, we're going to be net zero by 2050, that means nothing, like practically means nothing. So we as communicators have to help bring that to life on a day-to-day basis for everybody in the organization, and give voice to, you know, different parts of the business are going to have a different role to play. So we have to help them understand what that role is. And that's where we're kind of like an organizational glue. You know, we help at each management layer as you go deeper and deeper into the organization, we can help glue those layers together and make sure that you don't end up with the case of telephone, right, where the executives say one thing, and then you get to Joe Bloggs on the front line and he's heard something completely different, because through that chain of management meetings and so on, it all comes out a bit garbled. So we have a really important role to play there. I think we can also be a more accessible, more visible champion. You know, in a lot of organizations, I'm very lucky. We have a fairly flat, fairly small organization, so our executive team are directly accessible. But when your executive are further up and farther away, communicators can play a really important role in being the visible champion for things and helping make it real. So I think there are a lot of ways to crack that nut.
Absolutely. I've got a question here from Joanna, which I think is really important. I hate jargon and buzzwords. You know, I have always been on the digital side of communications, PR and marketing, and boy, does that have a lot of technocratic and, you know, jargonistic language. And Joanna is asking here, is there a danger that the technocratic language of ESG conceals the size of the threat to the planet? And actually, through this language, is it in danger of becoming a box-ticking exercise? Is there a role for us as professional communicators in bringing reality to the discussion and clarity into the discussion, rather than more acronyms? Who wants to take that as a question?
Well, I could pick that up, Michelle. In
Thank
fact,
you,
one of the earliest comments in social media when the report came out, somebody who said, actually, you lost me at ESG, you know, and the person, Rob Bruce, was right. He said, you lost me at ESG. And I said, well, look, we picked up the term and we're trying to explain it. And I agree with that. It in a way explains less than corporate social responsibility used to explain, or the triple bottom line. Even that was easier to understand than ESG now, the triple bottom line of people, planet and profits. So we do have a real task of explaining what's involved, and that runs through our whole practice. I mean, our practice loves jargon, and it will reinvent new terms to explain things that we've been working on for years. And we have to work against that as far as we can. It's very important in this area, and especially now. I mean, another point that's come up in the questions is about the problem of greenwashing. And one of the concerns about the current interest in ESG is that it's very easy to make claims. Stephen's referred to claims for targets that will be met in 2050. The big question is, what are people actually doing now? Will they really follow through on the commitments that they're making? And the UK government is running into problems at the moment with this, you know, making huge claims for the future, but then making decisions in the present, which seem to contradict the claims that are being made. And so this is a challenge in the whole area, that we have to be able to explain what the concerns are, and then we have to say very clearly what it is we're doing to address those concerns. And the last thing we can afford to do is to go into another box ticking exercise. The pandemic has showed that you can't deal with serious problems through box ticking. You simply can't.
Yeah, totally agree. We've got a question from Andras, which is related to measurement, and I'm just picking through this because there's lots of bits here, Andras. And I think what I'm seeing within your question is that actually traditionally communications professionals have not been aligned around a common set of metrics. But does ESG provide an opportunity for us to align our metrics to the board's metrics, the CFO's metrics, or anybody else within the organisation? So again, would anybody want to kind of take that as a question? It's a complex one, I think, Andras, because the reality is around ESG, there are very specific metrics that you need to report back on. But of course, there's a whole level of discussion around whether or not as a kind of a profession, we are leading in terms of standardization of metrics that are meaningful. Anybody want to pick that one up?
I'll take that. So brief comment in that, you know, the various frameworks that have been established by markets or investors or, you know, groups of management consultants do provide a framework for conversation that put us on parity with, you know, the other operational aspects of a business. And, you know, when you're talking about carbon emissions, it's a hard number. It's a very firm number. And everyone understands what it is and, you know, how you measure it. Or, you know, we're beginning to understand how we measure it. So I think it gives us a set of metrics by which we can prove our value to an organisation and which the organisation understands. And yes, you know, historically, we haven't been in that position. Yeah.
And certainly from a marketing perspective, with my marketing hat on, there are many different metrics that you can use, but ultimately there's a key performance indicator and a single metric that we need to move up towards. So I think it's for me, that's the same ambition with ESG metrics as well. We've got a question from Sean, and this is about global ESG strategies and cultural differences. And again, I'll open it up to anybody who wants to answer this one. Do you have any advice for developing an ESG strategy globally when stakeholders have very different perspectives on standards due to cultural differences, for example, in Japan and Asia versus European countries?
I mean, I can throw a super short answer in, which is if you're an international business that's listed on a stock exchange, you've got one set of rules. So on some level, you have to manage the application of the rules in a culturally sensitive way. But I mean, Stephen's just alluded to it there. At the end of the day, scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions are what they are. So you do have some kind of firmness to fall back on, which I think is really helpful for trying to cross some of those boundaries. But that's where I think the internal storytelling becomes really important, because if a global organization has made a commitment to something, every piece of that global organization has to play a part in delivering that thing. And I think the benefit with ESG compared to some other things is that the structure has a little bit more firmness to it than some other options, some other issues.
Thank you. There was a question that was sent ahead of time, and actually I sort of did some Googling as a result of this. In the survey, we found that nearly a third of those surveyed said that they'd taken no action to assess and manage their ESG risk. So are there any good examples out there? And Rebecca, you were very generous with this is how we approached it and this is how we got started. But are there any case studies, any good examples, any organisations that have kind of opened this up? So, you know, we can, you know, take a look at where to start, how to maintain, how to kind of break this down into something meaningful.
I'd go back, if I may, Michelle, I'd go back to the example we use in the report and trying to answer that question of organizations that have done a good job in this area. And the example we used was of Cadbury's, before they were taken over by Kraft, they were regarded as a model company. Their leaders were quoted as exemplars of best business practice, and the company itself was very clear in its purpose and objectives. And they had set up to deal with the issues raised by the company's business to be discussed at board level. And they had an unassigned board committee to discuss those issues and make sure that decisions were made on them that could be defended in public, but also implemented throughout the whole organization. So even though it's an older example, it's an example of a company that did open up, had an established record as one that was socially responsible, and it could deal with environmental issues and questions of social well-being, for example, in contributing, say, to children's diets or consumptions of confectionery. They had answers to those questions. And so I'd hold that up as an example of a company that can still be looked back to. But the other resource I wanted to mention to the group was the resource that can be found in the case center, the case clearinghouse of business school cases. If anybody is looking for good current examples of best practice, some of the cases found there will raise examples and also give models that people can assess their own practice against. There are some excellent discussions there to be referred to. I think that link will be posted in the chat so people can refer to that. But
thank you very much. Yeah.
That's one example that we came up with in the report.
Absolutely. We will pop it in the chat, and also with the follow-up blog post, we will also put a link in there as well. So that brings us quite nicely and roundly to the end of the session. We've recorded this session, so for those of you who have attended, if you want to share it with colleagues or if you want to watch it again, look out for the recording on the Vuelio blog and in our resource section of the website. And you'll also find John and Stephen's ESG report in the resources section too. If you've not downloaded it, it's an absolute belter. And I reread it again from front cover to back cover today, and it's extraordinarily helpful for those of us who are partway on our journey, at the start of the journey, or relatively mature as well. So it just leaves me to say thank you very much again to Rebecca, John and Stephen. Thanks for you all for joining today, and to sign off by saying, look, the creation of sustainable value coupled with environmental concerns and broad social well-being is something that I think we can all get behind. So thanks again for seeking to you in the audience, and also here with our wonderful panelists today, bringing some clarity around such an important topic. So that's us signing off, and goodbye everybody.